I've
Hmm?
just a second. Sorry, I've started streaming and recording, but is it window capturing? Google Meet.
Okay,
Right.
I don't see a recording marker
No, you cannot see
on the
that
call.
marker.
Usually in Google Meet it says that it's recording, right?
No,
On the
but
left hand side corner.
yes, but you cannot see because I'm using a third-party software to record things.
Oh,
I'm not exactly using Google Meet because my Google Meet is not the premium version. So only premium version Google Meet has that sort of facility to record. So I'm using third-party software. Ruth
oh.
is sorry, Ruth or Shresht. Can you just go and check the YouTube? Is that streaming or not?
Till now I can't find anything.
Okay,
So
let me try.
yeah.
I'll do that. Yeah, check. मार दे दो.
It is streaming. I just checked,
Is it streaming live?
and
Is it fine?
it is streaming.
What
Yeah,
what
it's
can you
streaming
see?
live. It's streaming your screen also.
Okay, what can you
Okay.
see right now?
Yeah, there's one live now.
Yep, I do see it.
What can you see? Like what's on the screen? Where is it?
YouTube.
Just a second. Can you
I can
see?
see. I just saw Sayantan's face. Yeah, now I can see our WhatsApp
Oh,
chat.
a person wants to join. Someone wants to join. What should I
Who
do?
wants to join?
I don't
Who
know.
wants to join?
Someone wants to join from outside the boat, and we are just checking right now. Should I wants to join? What should I
Who
do?
wants to join?
I don't
Who
know.
wants? I think at the moment you should just let everybody in. I don't
No,
think
no,
we'll
it's
ever
not about that.
reach
Uh-huh.
100 people on.
It's not that about that. It's about like we are just testing right now. Should I start admitting people?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so cool. I'm admitting people.
Pranjal, have you posted the link for the
Wait.
Google Meet on Discord?
No, I have not posted the link for Google Meet, and I cannot post because my screen is now being shared and it's visible on YouTube, so I cannot. We'll have to do that
Okay,
stuff.
so I'll do that.
Cool.
Okay, cool.
So, I don't know, while all of us are trying to figure the back end out, and since we already have people on the call, it would be great for me if you can tell me what are you hoping to hear in this talk. I know that hopefully none of you have watched my presentation yet. So, if any of you can unmute yourselves and please tell me what is it that you hope to get from the talk. I'm going to take notes if that's okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. I asked this before, but I'd like to ask this again. If any of you would like to unmute yourselves and tell me what did you think of the talk before you are joining it? Why are you joining it? What do you expect to get out of it? I would be very happy. I will take notes if that's okay, but it just helps all of us get comfortable to the fact that someone's going to be speaking for a long time. It gives me some feedback on how much of my talk should be addressing your concerns. Anybody who wants to really speak up, please do.
Hi, I'm Anupam, and this is my first time.
Hi
Jo-
Arupam, hi.
Hi, and this is my first time joining in live. That is my first time in Project Encephalon. So I'm interested in
Welcome
live.
to Project Encephalon. Welcome to Project Encephalon.
Thank you, and so let's see.
Yeah, so for me, it was I'm Shresht. For me, it was basically like I started watching like stuff on neurofeminism, and I started uh, looking at googling it and all, and I realized that for me, what it basically meant was, correct me if I'm wrong. For me, what it basically meant was that so the studies which have been done in neurosciences until now, they have been very skewed in terms of gender representation. Like we still have that orthodox concept of gender, that it is something which is deterministic and it is something which is binary. But as neuroscience students, I think we should be the first ones to really understand that it is not actually that deterministic, and there is a concept of gender fluidity, and it's not that you are a male or you are a female. It's more like what you think of yourself at that particular point. And I think so, yeah, I think that is something which I would also want a little more clarity on, the main concept of what gender actually stands for, and obviously like
Okay.
the representation of various genders in neuroscientific data analysis for its to maintain the biasness of research is also, I think, very important. So yeah, that is also something I would want. Like if we include the representation of all genders and this concept of gender, in which we think about gender fluidity, then how is it going to change our results? How is it going to change our interpretation? Yeah.
Right. I don't think I will have a solid answer to that question, at least the last bit in this talk, but we'll try to discuss at the end, Shresht. I'll get back to you about this for sure. Anybody
Sure,
else
sure,
who'd
sure.
like to, yeah, anybody else who'd like to share some stuff about what motivates you to come for the talk, or what do you expect from the talk?
Hello, I'm Sabah.
Hi.
So I'm doing biochemistry right now, and I got to know about Project Encephalon through Shresht. So he's a very good marketing affairs in charge of yours. So I think kudos to him. So I'm here. Otherwise, I honestly have no exposure to neuroscience as of now. I'm particularly here just for fun to know what it is about, and so that I can explore different fields. So I'm really looking forward to this talk that way because this is going to be my first neuroscience talk, so it's going to mean a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, I'm really glad about it, but at the same time, I don't know how much of hardcore neuroscience am I going to be able to bring to the talk, but we'll definitely look at some methods, some philosophies, and we'll try to see whether we can use, some of our knowledge from our sister feminists and look at neuroscience in that context. So it's sort of more a framework oriented approach to in the talk today. But yeah, thank you for coming, and I hope, and I'm pretty sure that the following talks, the journal clubs that happen, would definitely be helping you explore your neuroscience interest.
Yes, thank you actually, because nowadays I have something uh to look up to during the weekends, you know. So I think it's
Mm-hmm.
nice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else who would like to share? I mean, we have 25 minutes really before we start. I don't know, with the monotones. So, if anybody here would like to share some stuff, would be very happy. Oh, I'm taking notes, by the way.
Okay, so while we start, we could probably tell you the beginnings of Project Encephalon. So we started from the monsoon brain meet, if you guys have attended that. And what started from the monsoon brain meet was just a meager attempt to sort of come together as undergraduates and have a database for all undergraduates so that we could interact with each other and we could know each other well. And from there it started, and we now have more than 450 members. And we were earlier called SIGN, which is Students Interest Group in Neuroscience, and we changed our name to Project Encephalon. We have been having journal clubs. We have a lot of events planned out. We have reading clubs in making. We have Sapiens in Neuroscience, in which we look at the story of one person who has done a lot every week or so. And it's been a wonderful journey. I mean, in this lockdown, when people are uh, thinking about different things and it's not really very productive, I think for me personally, this has been the most productive uh, outcome of the lockdown. And I think this will go for a very long distance, and we will continue to. So our main goal is to make a community of neuroscientists and budding neuroscience enthusiasts who are going to sort of sort of get to know each other and collaborate with each other. And we also have a scientific advisory committee. So if anyone of the professors is watching this, you could probably collaborate with us as a mentor. And we have a lot of students ranging from PhDs, uh, BScs, master's students. So yeah, you get a very diverse range of students and a very diverse range of activities to be followed. Yeah. Yeah, correct. Now would be a good time because after this, the meet is going to start. So if anyone has any suggestions and anyone wants to come to the screen and tell us how we can improve or how we can become better, you are most welcome. Because it is like together that we'll be able to sort of get to the best uh, form that we can achieve. Okay, so for me, it was basically since like fifth standard onwards, I had this interest in behavioral sciences and I had interest in psychology. And I have so what I used to do is I used to go to the Delhi metro and I used to observe what people were doing and how I know it's very creepy, but like the whole talking thing and the foot tapping thing. If they are moving their fingers, how are they moving their fingers? Why are they moving their fingers? So from that point onwards, I sort of like I knew that I had to do something about something related to behavior. I wanted to understand the enigma of the brain, and just this winter, I did an internship at the Lab of Neural Circuitry and Behavior at ICER Pune under Dr. Nixon Abraham. So there I learned a lot, and I realized finally that this is something in which I want to make a career. This is something which I want to do. Yeah. What about you, Amartya? Okay, so Karthika is saying I was also interested in behavioral neurosciences, and I'm working on neural networks. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I don't mind. I don't mind at all.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So,
Is
Sayantan,
my screen visible? I'm sorry. Is my screen visible?
yeah, yeah, it is visible. It is visible.
And okay, all right, all right.
Okay. So we are starting now. Cool.
Do you want me to start right away?
Okay, I'll introduce you to the
Okay, 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 okay.
to the
All
people
right,
here.
all right.
And so people, today we have our fourth journal club, and please welcome Sayantan Datta. They are pursuing a PhD at TIFR Hyderabad and are a budding neuroscientist. They are also the project coordinator at Life of Sciences magazine, and they are also teaching communication and writing at the Kriya University. We were lucky that at a very early stage itself for Project Encephalon, they got associated with us and are currently the head of the Code of Conduct Committee, and they have been a very dear friend and a very able mentor. So yeah, Shantan, you can take it from here.
Thanks. Thank you for that very kind introduction. So, before I begin the talk, I would just like to mention as to why, like why choose this over talking about developmental neuroscience, neurobiology, which is what I do in the lab. And that's because if when you come from the identities that I come from, I identify as queer in various ways and feminist in various ways. What you realize is that in science there's this major dichotomy. What I must tell you is that often these communications between say feminist politics and sciences are often fraught with discomfort, fraught with things that are either saddening or no, I mean sort of not so pleasant things for both the disciplines. So what one needs to keep in mind when one is talking about feminism and sciences coming together or using feminist frameworks to look at scientific data of any sort is to think about how can that critique make us better scientists. So, with that note, what I would like to first raise before we even venture into neuroscience and neurofeminism is what makes one think that science is a feminist issue. And this is not a question that I am raising for the first time. This is a question that has been addressed by feminist philosophers, feminist scholars, feminist critical theories, experts, theorists who have tried to understand how can science communicate with feminism. What does feminism has to contribute to this pursuit of science? And one of the things that I would then like to do is highlight as to why is science a feminist issue. And this sort of has its hold on the fact that science is more often than not assumed to be a form of truth, and a form of truth that is objective in nature, a truth that is truth for everybody. And from this notion of science being an objective, irrefutable truth is what comes out is the ability of science to predict, control, define, and restrict reality. Now, given that science doesn't exist in vacuum and science is performed by science practitioners, scientists in their places of performing science, be it a laboratory or otherwise, men from privileged identities, they are, I mean, if you are outside the Indian context, then you're probably more familiar with white cisgender heterosexual men, while if you are in the Indian context, you're probably more familiar with cisgender heterosexual men doing I come from an institution where there is one woman faculty and only one woman faculty across disciplines in that institution. So in that case, if science is trying to control, predict, define, and restrict reality, the question that one needs to ask is whose version of reality is it then? And I'll leave with that question. I'll not attempt to answer it right away. Hopefully, we'll be able to return to it towards the end of the talk and derive some ideas and discuss on them further. But one more thing that we need to keep in mind that science is very selective about what counts as knowledge. And this is something that Evelyn Keller has pointed out in her works in the 1980s, where she has constantly been talking about that science loves to work within an established framework, and whatever science counts as knowledge, that already established framework. Any data that does not fit that established framework is often discarded and never looked into. So these are a few questions about the practice of science that we as feminists tried to raise. And this brings me to understanding the focus of this talk, which is trying to understand whether neuroscience can be a feminist issue. And this is something that's really on the left hand side, my left hand side of the screen. Emil Huschke, he was a neuroanatomist in Germany who was looking at anatomical structures. And what he discovered, what he claimed to discover was that the frontal lobe in men is supposed to be 1% larger than the frontal lobe in women. And if you look at the right hand side figure, that the area that's glowing in red orange is what the frontal lobe is. It's highly thought of, often thought of as the seat of higher order cognitive functions, as the seat of intelligence, and some of these things that make us who we are. And Emil Huschke's understanding was that, well, if the frontal lobe is larger, then that definitely points towards the fact that men must be more intelligent than women. And while one would think that this is something that must have been very popular in the 1850s, what I did today morning while I was preparing for this talk was just on PubMed sex differences in the brain, which is 100 years after Huschke did his work. 100 years after Huschke did his work, there have been about 25,000 hits that PubMed can offer, which means you can take away some and give away some. Some must not have been registered on PubMed. Some of these must be false entries. But nonetheless, what it tells you is that there's a huge number of studies that are still being done on finding sex differences in the brain. And on the bottom, what you see is a timeline of the number of papers published about sex differences in the brain in years. And what you see is that that interest is steadily rising across the years as we move through years into our present and probably into the coming future. You see that the number of papers are rising, which means that there is a growing interest. It's not just a stable interest, but a growing interest in trying to find out the biological basis of what makes us who we are, and then linking it to why should we be treated in the way that we are treated. And this thing called this is one of the things that is often labeled as biological determinism, the fact that biology has the ability to determine everything. And often our science is very biologically deterministic. Neuroscience has a tendency to be really biologically deterministic. As you go ahead, what you see is towards the late 1980s, there was a very renewed interest in trying to understand what makes us homosexual versus heterosexual. And this is also because that was a time when a lot of HIV/AIDS cases were on the rise and stuff was happening around, queer rights was being spoken about. And Freud had spoken but I think it translates to like the in his is thus Schicksal. And that did inspire a series of studies where people tried to find out whether one can see sexuality in the brain. And what you see on the left is a study, one of the most popular and very early studies from two people called Hoffman and Schwab, again, two people who were neuroanatomists have what they did was they took this is an autopsy based study, so they took brains from people who died of quote unquote natural causes, because AIDS apparently is never a natural cause. Anything that affects people from a marginalized sexuality seems to not be a natural cause. But the reference group was technically people who died quote unquote natural causes other than HIV AIDS, nucleus, which is a part of the brain in the hypothalamus. I don't know. I mean, I think it's in the and neurons that do a particular task. So, and then somebody looked at brains from homosexual people who had died of AIDS and compared these two to the brains of people who had died of AIDS but were heterosexual. And what they observed was that homosexual people who died of AIDS seemed to have the largest suprachiasmatic nucleus among the three groups. And it was thought that, oh, well, we have found out the anatomical basis of sexuality. The bigger your suprachiasmatic nucleus, the more gay you are. And one didn't stop there. 1991, Simone Lavey published what is called a landmark study in understanding the anatomical basis of sexuality, where Simone Lavey looked at, so there's this part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Again, it's a part which does various things, and yeah, and people started looking at four nuclei, interstitial nuclei in the anterior hypothalamus. This fed to the line of research that was trying to characterize sexuality in the brain in terms of anatomy. And a lot of people did believe it for some time. It caused a lot of furor till somebody called Anna Foster Sterling, who was who was a zoologist by training, but also a very critical feminist scholar, wrote a review of Simone Lavey's 1993 book on the brain and sexuality in the brain. And she reviewed this book, and what she pointed out was that in 1991, our anatomic techniques weren't so if you look at these interstitial nuclei in the hypothalamus, they're really tiny, extremely small. And if you look at Lavey's sections, what they just look at, and by sections I mean you take the brain up, you chop it into various slices, and you look at each slice and find out the part of the brain that you want to look at. And the interstitial nuclei are really small, and when you look at these sections, you put a stain on it, what you see is that they are just a bunch of dots. They're like many dots all over your screen. And unless and until somebody takes a pen and circles some place which, like only that person can identify, you'll understand, oh, that's the nucleus. Other than that, it's very difficult to find out interstitial nuclei of anterior hypothalamus looking at sections. So what Anna Foster Sterling did is she not only critiqued the impact that such a study has on how queer people are perceived and treated in the society, but also pointed out methodological flaws of early conclusions from such studies. And the other line of research that contributed to this question about sexuality in the brain is genetic research that also was gaining popularity post the works of pioneering work by Seymour Benzer and Sidney Brenner, who started the fields of neurogenetics, where they could use genetic model organisms to look at the brain per se, and how the brain develops and how the brain functions. And two genes which were very interestingly identified from fruit flies. One was called double sex, and the other was called fruitless. Both of these genes were identified in Drosophila, which are fruit flies, and people thought that, well, we have, that's a sort of God complex of science. We have finally found out the genetic basis of sexuality. And genetic basis of while people were thinking that, well, genetic basis of sexuality is out there with us now, what people realized is that these genes, both fruitless and double sex, do not have any orthologs or homologs in human beings. So there's no way that you can try to find out a gay gene that resembles the behavior of fruitless or double sex in human beings. And however, it did not stop researchers from going ahead. And this person called Dean Hammer claimed that in the X chromosome, Q28, XQ28, so X chromosome has a short arm and a large arm. You look at the large arm, which is the Q arm, and towards the tip of it lies this particular banding pattern. So if you take chromosomes and you put particular dyes on it, what you see is chromosomes have bands, and these bands are very typical to, one can identify functions based on removing those bands. So you remove that band from a chromosome and you see what effect does it have on the organism. And you can tell that, well, this band contains a gene for X. So what this fellow did is he tracked bands on the X chromosome Q28 locus between twins who were gay. So he took monozygotic twins and fraternal twins, and he tracked their chromosomes, and he saw whether the way that the chromosomes getting passed on, whether that's also showing whether sexuality thing that pattern. He found, and this is a science paper, that the first gene for sexuality in human beings has been discovered. And then much later in 2019, what happened was a group of bioinformaticians collected about 500,000 genomes and looked at DNA markers and realized that, well, they look like there are 5 putative markers that are associated with sexual behavior. But at the same time, none of these genes seem to have the power to predict the sexuality of an individual, which brings me to the question that I was trying to ask is, what do you think must have been the motive of these studies that were trying to find out the genetic basis of sexuality? I'll leave you with this question. Again, we'll try to come back to this question towards the end of this talk. And so in that case, I hope that I've convinced you successfully that neuroscience is a feminist issue. As feminists who deal with issues of discrimination and equality, one does need to worry about the kind of biases that neuroscience research is progressing, as well as how neuroscience works through to generate its data. For example, making subjects out of queer people just to show that, well, what you have is curative. Because once you find a biological basis for a particular, and this is sort of treating being gay as a biological condition, just like people try to find out the molecular genetic basis of, say, Parkinson's disease so that you can develop newer therapeutic measures. One might claim that this might have been the motive for studying the genetic basis of sexuality, so that once you find out what makes somebody gay, you now have a host of curative remedies that you can test and see whether queerness can, as an identity, can be alleviated from the society. So while science claims to be very objective, I mentioned earlier that science is not done in vacuum. It's done by scientists in a particular space. And a scientist has their own social assumptions and their own personal assumptions. And the science that we do is often motivated by utility and value, two things that guide science when we are trying to do science in a capitalist society. What function does my science serve, and what do I gain out of my science? And then there are social and personal assumptions. So if science is done with these things happening around us, then we come back to the question about whether science is really objective. And this is a question that has been asked by feminist scholars for quite some time. And a very interesting answer came from one person called Donna Haraway. You see Donna Haraway with her dog on the left-hand side of the screen, where Donna Haraway tries to answer the question by saying that, when we as scientists try to find out an objective truth, we lose out on generating true knowledge. So what she says is that all knowledge is situated in our social personal assumptions, our politics, our ethics, and by acknowledging these biases that we have, that are biases that stem from our social assumptions, personal assumptions, our understanding of utility and value, our ethical and political considerations, is when we will be able, and if we mention this as a context to the science that we are doing, what we are enabling people to do is look at our science in the way that it is generated. So what Donna Haraway says is there are these four planes that have to constantly talk to each other and have to provide a context to our science for our science to become better. One is epistemological plane, which tells us about the knowledge that we are generating. Ontological frames as to how did this knowledge came into being. Then there are ethical considerations that we took while generating this knowledge, and political considerations. What were the political motivations that we took to generate this knowledge? Somebody who was trying to look at, for example, sexuality in the brain was the person trying to really find out the genetic basis of sexuality so that it could be used as a curative therapy, because that's a political consideration, that's a consideration of discrimination, and it allows, and if I know of it, then it allows me to look at that study in that particular light, derive what knowledge I can out of it, and leave the rest there. So with this, I think what I have essentially done right now is give you a couple of things that neurofeminists are trying to juggle in their head when we look at neuroscience data. And what I'll try to tell you now is one line of critique that has come from neurofeminist discourses. I must mention that neurofeminism as an independent framework, as a discourse in both feminism and sciences is pretty recent. Around 2010 is when a couple of people met together and started calling themselves neurofeminists. So it's only a decade old. But even in this decade, what one has is lines of critique on neuroscience data, and it's not really possible for me to pick up all the lines and discuss them. But what I would like to do is pick one particular line of critique which is pretty popular among neurofeminists, and that is of brain imaging using functional magnetic resonance. I am not a fMRI researcher. I work with flies, but those of you who are would probably be able to add more to this discussion, so please do. But what you have in front of you is a table that shows some data from people who've been trying to find out functional differences between the brain of male and female subjects that you see on the screen. So for example, when you look at language, a paper from 2003 published in a particular journal shows that in female brains, the bilateral superior temporal gyrus and the left inferior frontal gyrus, I think, light up more. Light up means they show more activity when we are engaging on an active language. And in male, it's the left inferior frontal gyrus, left superior temporal gyrus, and cingulate regions. And when you look at the table, you see that you will see differences between parts that light up. And the reason why I say parts that light up is because when you look at fMRI data, what you technically see is a black and white brain with orange yellow spots that indicate increased activity in those regions. And this table shows that this research is, this line of research that's trying to find out functional differences between brains of males and females is really still in vogue. And people have come up with a variety of regions that seem to function differently for different purposes in the male and female brains. But the critique that has come is a critique that says there's a lot that the fMRI data follows a pipeline where it takes a physical brain, maps it into non-physical data, which is then used to recreate a representation of brain activity. And this data is generated by a staircase of correlations. Brain activity, when one says increased brain activity, it's correlated to increased blood flow. And this increased blood flow is correlated to increased levels of oxygenated blood. What has also been observed is that many neural states can give the same signal. Those of you who work with neuroimaging might know that signal to noise ratios are not very great. In fact, very slight movements in the fMRI machine distorts the image to a really, really great extent. And it is in this translation of the physical brain to a representation of the brain is what one calls a space for mischief. People who, so one can make data. So because this data is constructed, what happens is that this construction is dependent on the theoretical approach that was taken in this analysis, the methods that were applied during the experiment, negotiations, political negotiations, ethical negotiations within a lab, what was the aim of that research and the beliefs of researchers. And a lot of you, if you've worked with neuroimaging before, might be able to say that your analysis has to be really, really strict and really, really tight, because if you do not do it properly, I'm pretty sure that neuroimaging can show you whatever you want to see. Also, once you have generated the data, what happens is that increased regions of brain activity, they're mapped on a structure of a brain which is called the standard. And the standard is definitely, it's just one standard, and biology is not perfect. All of us have brains of different sizes, different shapes, and different our brains are really different even in terms of structure. So when one maps these increased areas of brain activities on a standard brain, there is a high chance that you're mapping the wrong areas. So this is one thing that neurofeminists have tried to show, that how neuroscience data can often be misleading and why one needs to take these methodological critiques into consideration to generate better data. A little bit about neurofeminism as a movement is that in 2010, like I mentioned, for the first time, a network of neurofeminists was formed called the Neurogenderings Network. It's an international and transdisciplinary network that has aimed and still aims to elaborate on both theoretical and empirical approaches and on how neuroscientists investigate questions of sex, gender, and sexuality. While I showed you one particular line of critique, which was about neuroimaging, and it was just really, really scratching the surface. It's the critique goes much farther into it, but critiques that have also come up are on terminological questions. Like, we as neuroscientists often use the word sex and gender replaceably, interchangeably, but that's not really the case. Psychologists in the 1960s and then scholars of sex, gender, and sexuality in the 1980s have pointed out many, many times that sex and gender are two different concepts. Sex is more biologically determined, while gender is a social construction. Although we are also now inclined to look at sex as a social construction, the other line of critiques that have come up is the line of research that looks at sex and gender in biology and in the brain, kind of stuff that I was showing you earlier. Critiques have come up on the ethics of doing such research. There have been larger critiques that have come up on the philosophy of science and the notion of embodiment. The last bit before I end this talk, I would like to talk a little bit about science communication, which is something that I am deeply foraging into these days, and how neurofeminism and a feminist critique can also apply to how we convey our science. So what you see here is a table that on the first column there's the title of the journal article itself, and all these articles were studying sex, gender, and sexuality. In the middle is the media headline. So when the study was published, some media house picked it up. You see the media headline, and some phrases that you used in the media article. Some of this can be really triggering, so I would advise you, I'm not going to read it out loud, but I will give you 1 full minute to read what's written here. Okay. And 1 more minute to read some more. Take another minute to read some more. Remember, the order is the same. The journal article that was published, the media headline, and phrases from the media article. So, I mean, if you've even read the first row of these two images, what you realize is that there's a heavy misrepresentation that happens when one communicates science that is done in the lab. And this is what I refer to as constructed versus performed research, where the research that we are doing in the lab talks about something, and then when it is supposed to be put out in the media for a popular science audience, for a popular audience, for a lay person audience in quotes, to be read, understood, and worked upon, the research gets constructed. Suddenly, somebody says the sensory circuitry for sexual attraction in C. elegans males is suddenly over expanded into a claim like sexual orientation is genetic in worms. And as science communicators and as science writers, those of us who do it, one needs to be really, really careful about how we allude to research that is done in the lab in our media articles, because what we do in the lab stays in the lab and often is read only in very close circles. But once it is out in the media, our science suddenly gains a lot more power and has the ability to impact a lot more people. And that's why I would like you to remain skeptical of articles in the media that might come with headlines like this or insights like the ones in the right column, and ensure that when you go ahead to communicate your science or somebody else's, you keep in mind that your summaries of research should be true to what has been said. You shouldn't transform them into overclaims. And such a way of doing science communication might really bust a lot more myths about sex, gender, and sexuality, at least, and save a lot of people from unfair discrimination and oppression. It has often, I mean, I can share personal experiences where I have heard from people who have had really horrible times with their families because some random article has said that, well, this is the reason why sexuality, why somebody is gay, for example, and this is what you can do to cure it. And I can assure you, as somebody who is queer and somebody who is a scientist, that that's not true. And we need to be really, really more careful in how we communicate our science. With this, I would like to acknowledge a couple of people. I had given some of the slides in this presentation were modified from a talk that I had given with a very dear friend of mine, Shalini Mahadev, to Anveshi Resource Center for Women. And everybody else on the list has really been extremely helpful in terms of the feedback that they have provided. I have provided 2 articles that you can use to read further. I will leave my slides with Project Encephalon, and if anybody requires those slides, please feel free to write to me or the Project Encephalon group. All references are at the end of the slides, and you should be able to go ahead and explore the discipline. Happy to take questions at the moment. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, I have a question. So, I have a group of just like people who study biology together, and someone sent this paper. I think they had like it was study of mice, and that they had sort of decreased chemically the level of 5-HT in the brain, and they
Okay,
noticed that
5-HT is dopamine, is it? Or
serotonin.
serotonin? Serotonin, correct. Thank you.
And so they noticed that female mice were spending longer time smelling the mice of other the genitals of other female mice compared to male mice.
Okay,
And then so
okay.
someone's like, so I guess someone just went up in the group and they're like, oh, I guess mice with less serotonin are lesbians. And it's horrifying to hear that, but I don't know how to appropriately counter that in the movement.
Uh, so one thing is that if you would send the paper over, we can sort of discuss it one day and see whether there are any methodological frameworks that we can look at. But at the same time, what one should ask is what motivated the researcher to pursue this question, A, and B, also you might also allude to other studies that have looked at very similar stuff. There was a paper, I think about 6-7 years back in some journal, some absurd journal at the same time, which said, which really claimed that, oh, you give this particular odor to male mice and they tend to become homosexual mice. And when I read that paper to understand what it is really trying to say, because, well, I smell something and I become gay sounds very interesting as an argument. So what I see is what they say is that the measure of the mouse becoming gay was not the mouse having sex or trying to have sex with another male mouse, but not leaving its compartment. It they said that it stopped visiting female compartments. Who knows, maybe the odor was really bad and the mouse was really scared and it didn't leave its compartment. Can I extend the understanding of can I extend this observation that a male mouse is not leaving its compartment where there are other males to go mate with the female mouse in another compartment to the claim that this particular odor has made mice gay? So, I mean, this is just an anecdote that you might want to look into, but yeah, I mean, what I suggest is that let's discuss the paper once.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, so I have a question, which is so do you think this could also lead to some kind of a selection error when researchers tend to take in subjects for their studies? Would there be an error of sort, say, if they take people from a certain sexuality, their results might vary in certain cases, something like that?
Um, I mean, I get where you're going with the question. Let me just try to give you a couple of things that have already been done in this field. And this is also some neurofeminist research that has happened. One is whenever people work with medication for mental health issues, for example, anxiety medications, there's a heavy prevalence to use only male animals for that research, male mice, male rats. Because a popular belief is that female rats, female mice may have there are a lot of hormones that might be messing up with your experiments. So there's a tendency to just use male rats. Very interestingly, nobody seems to recognize that male mice and male rats have hormones too. And at the same time, nobody seems to recognize that then you're making medicines only for male. And some people have tried to, some people, at least one person in the neurogenderings network itself is trying to see whether the same anxiety medications, alprazolam, clonazepam, any of these medications that are very popular for use in against anxiety, whether one can use these anxiety medications in female animals and whether you get the same result or different results. Now, both the directions have important implications. If you see same results, same effectiveness, and the kind of studies that we do with pharmacology, if you see that the drug is as harmless and as effective for female mice as it is for, say, male mice, then you realize that it's rubbish. I mean, you don't need to distinguish. You don't need to use only and only male animals for research. And on the other hand, if you do notice a difference, what you then realize is that, oh my God, for about 100 years, we've been treating women, we've been treating female-bodied people with medicines that are possibly not working on them or
Yeah.
are harming them in different ways, and this is the time to develop newer medicines. So what it brings me back to is the fact that one needs to spend considerable amount of time engaging with these critiques so that your science improves as a whole. Does
I
that
mean,
answer your question, Ankush?
yeah. So, say females are, as data suggests, are nearly twice prone to having anxiety issues as males are. So, I just came to know about whatever you said about using male rats to formulate the medicines. I think wouldn't that be a huge problem? Would that suffice medication for female patients? So would that be good for them? I mean, we are testing it on male rats and then going on to participants who might be male, not female. I don't know for sure.
I mean, yeah, that's exactly what I was also trying to say. I concur with you here that these are questions that we need to investigate much more finely. And that is what some people have been trying to do. Some people have been trying to take these very common medications, alprazolam, clonazepam, very commonly used to deal with anxiety issues, and they are now checking, trying to replicate the data that has been that has been done on male animals using female animals and see whether there are changes in data. And whatever direction the data goes, you have a new vacuum that is generated that one needs to fill in through your science, and once that is filled in, your science becomes better,
Yeah.
more
Okay. So one
complete,
more
more
question.
nuanced.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So one more question is also, are there any specific areas in the brain, in your opinion, that are more prone to changes due to sexuality? I know
I
you
don't.
mentioned hypothalamus, so I guess hypothalamus is a region.
No, but
Other
what
than
I
that,
was trying to also say, what I was also trying to say, and I'm sorry if the point didn't get across very clearly, is that we don't know whether those differences are real. I mean, the fact that ENA3 is whatever smaller or larger in homosexual men is, I mean, look, in 1991, doing an anatomy, trying to find out one, hypothalamus itself is a pretty small region in the entire brain, and it has a variety of nuclei, out of which you're looking at one nucleus, particular nucleus, which is ENA3, and it's really tiny. If you look at Lave's original data, it's white background with black dots all over it. That is what the data is. And then there are some 4 random arrows in the figure, which say this is the ENA3. Now, when I, as somebody who is not accustomed to looking at human brain sections and looking at hypothalamic nuclei, look at that picture, it really means nothing to me. Unless and until Simon Lave points out and says, this is ENA3 and this is smaller / larger. And this is something that Foster Sterling and contemporaries have tried to critique by saying that probably people were finding out what they wanted to find out in these sections. We don't know whether those differences are real. And about your question, whether similar differences exist between female brains, I really have no idea. That's my answer. But if you do find some research that attempts to point that out, please do send it over and I'll be very, very happy to look into it.
yeah, cool. Thank you.
I know that Bittu is here. Bittu, do you know of any such research that has tried to look at female brains and, I don't know, find sexuality in there?
Well, okay, so 2 3 things. I mean, I don't know that there's been much work done on. Sorry, is my audio glitching? Can you?
No,
Yeah,
I
we
can
can
hear
hear
you,
you.
Bittu, very clearly, very clearly.
All right. So essentially, we know that there's not been a lot of investigation of female sexuality, where even the words female, is not particularly well defined. But I would say two things. One is that I don't think, at least for me, I'm not. I've seen multiple studies look at the INAH, and so I'm not so concerned with this question of, is this actually bigger than that or not? The larger question really is that brains change structurally, not just in response to experience, right? And so all of these studies are unable to, right? I mean, this is it's a confound. They're unable to control for experience. So essentially, it's not as if, and you'll find forget about sexuality. I mean, just look at gender itself, right? If you compare brains that are considered to belong to sexed bodies, male and female bodies, they're all sort of structurally modified by the experience of living in a particular gendered category throughout life, and it's impossible to strip that gendered experience away from a brain while trying to make so essentially it's impossible without with this confound to try and make claims at least about human brains based on this. Of course, I mean, there are other aspects of parts of the brain. So, for example, the bed stria nucleus of the stria terminalis, which are associated, or which has been associated in sort of, in fact, less well done, much smaller, sample size kind of experiments with transgender identity, quote unquote. Again, none of which are able to control for life experience. So I think this is one of the major critiques of all of these, at least human-specific data. Which is that they don't control for lived experience in a gender, and they're not able to separate genetic causality from experience-based causality of brain structure. The second thing that's also important to remember is that a lot of the frameworks that you speak of come from a perspective, of course, of seeing queerness of some kind as some kind of aberration. Right. And so, as Ira said, this question of sort of, do you have to do something to, are depressed mice gay, etc., etc. In fact, there have been queer scientists as well, I should point out. I mean, much of their queerness is invisibilized in their publications. But I know that some of the people, so for example, the people who did the work looking at the vomeronasal organ in rats, and how mutations in the vomeronasal organ changed the sexuality of rats. And some of these were queer scientists, right? So they were not necessarily heterosexuals trying to kind of, pathologize queer people. But the fact remains that, that kind of framework still studies queerness as a mutation/aberration away from the norm. And I think there's one sort of line of work which is quite interesting, which is the stuff that looks at naturally occurring homosexuality as sort of and looks for selective forces that uphold it. So essentially looking at the ways in which, so for example, the seed beetle work looking at evolution of seed beetles and the ways in which genes that are related to what's called same-sex behavior, right? That those kinds of behaviors are sort of actually, variously not just mutationist, can't be just explained by a mutationist framework, but are actually adaptively useful. So that I think, in terms of centering and sort of looking at the adaptational sort of value of these kinds of variations, is an interesting line of work that sort of takes away from the we're all just deviations or sort of a mutation away from straightness kind of framework.
Also, yeah, thanks a lot, Bittu.
Yeah.
Bittu is a very dear friend and an associate professor of biology and psychology at Ashoka University. Also somebody who's much more into neuroscience than I am at the moment. But to add on to whatever Bittu said, this line about plasticity of the brain is also something that it comes back to the critique of neuroimaging. Whenever people are taking snapshots of the brain using fMRI, what you're looking at is one point in time, the brain, how it is, and the brain is probably not going to be the same in a couple of hours from then. And neuroimaging really only captures snapshots of the brain and never the journey of how that brain came into being. So thanks a lot, Bittu, for sharing it forth. I just thought it would be better if somebody more potent to answer that question does that rather than I
No,
myself.
you're doing a great job, and thanks for the talk as well. I really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you, thanks a lot, Right. I'm
Okay,
happy to take more questions if there are.
okay. So I have another question. So, so what I was thinking was, how do scientists usually study homosexual brains in, say, animal models? Is there a certain way that they do that?
One thing, if I might mention right away, and it might be good to mention it then, is that whenever we are referring to people with certain identities, we refer to them as people with identities. We say that homosexual people, we don't say homosexual brains, or we
No.
say,
I was
I mean,
saying
no,
as
no,
in
it is an
cohort. Yeah.
important, just a
Sorry.
second, Ankush, just a second, just a second. I'm sorry. But it's important to keep in mind that if you take the people bit away from these conversations, what you're essentially doing is dehumanizing people. So it's just essential to remember that we no longer call people PD patients, Parkinson's disease patients, but patients with Parkinson's disease, because there's a lot more to them than just their Parkinson's disease. Similarly, there's a lot more to queer people than just being queer, and hence you say queer people and not something else. You just don't say gay. I
Okay.
mean, you just don't say a gay. That's not the defining principle of that person. You say a gay person. I mean, so you always use that identity as an adjective and not as a noun.
Sorry about
And
that.
coming to the question of how people study that research, that line of sexuality research in animal models, I gave you one example where somebody thinks that staying in your own cage with other male rats is an evidence of homosexuality in male mice. Apparently, some scientists think that that's good enough. And some, at least in Drosophila, what one says is that if you mutate double sex or fruitless, what these otherwise heterosexual flies would do is try to court and mate with other male flies. And in Drosophila, courtship is a very characterized, step-by-step looked into behavior. There are 6 steps that a fly follows before it courts and mounts. And I think that's what one would track to study whether there's quote unquote homosexual flies or not. But yeah, these are some of the frameworks. I'm sure there are more, but yep.
Thanks, that answers my question.
Mhm.
One more thing I wanted to add. So Ankush said that women are more likely to suffer from anxiety, but it's a matter of diagnosis. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with, depression or anxiety.
Yeah, and
Men are more.
also adding on to it, Ira, just because you mentioned it, and thank you for mentioning it. What's also important is that women's experiences are majorly shaped by the patriarchal, misogynist society that they live in. I mean, a woman is much more susceptible to violence of various kinds and discriminations of various kinds that sort of builds into the person being more anxious. So, and that is often forgotten when people say that women are supposedly more anxious than men. It probably is cis heterosexual men who, with their systemic violence, have made women more prone to be anxious. And that's an anxiety which stems in societal patriarchy and misogyny. But yeah, please go ahead. I just thought it might be good to put it
Yeah.
out here.
Yeah, so women are more likely to approach a mental health professional when they feel the need to, as opposed to men. So you'll see women are diagnosed more likely to be diagnosed with depression, but suicide rate is much higher in men. So it's also not just, it's women are more likely to have, XYZ mental health problem. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with XYZ health problem. And I guess adding on to this, I had attended this talk by Dr. Marlene Zook, and she says she dislikes drawing parallels between homosexual behavior and something like a fruit fly or a monkey and in homosexuality in humans, because in humans you have obviously this whole entire social aspect to it. There is a cultural aspect to it. There is cis heteronormativity, and then there is homophobia, and then there are all of these layers that make homosexuality in humans so much more complicated than just one fly going to, perform a courtship fly to another male fly. So it's a lot more complicated because there is that entire social aspect to it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for mentioning this.
Okay, I have a question. Um,
Please
so
go ahead.
even in the beginning, you mentioned that in your own institute, there is less female representation as to like you have only one female faculty. Um,
I do. Yep, we
yeah.
do.
So
Yeah.
so about that, the results which you presented right now. How important does it become to have a diverse community of neuroscientists from all genders per se to perform an active research and to like publish articles and papers? So because I think a lot of it stems from the fact that most of the neuroscientists even right now are male. It are males right now. Even in the research field, we have observed this in my own institute as well. So how important does it become to have a diverse community of neuroscientists or any type of researchers for that matter?
So when we say diverse people, I'm assuming that when you say diverse neuroscientists, what you mean is people who are diverse and are neuroscientists.
Correct.
And to answer that question, what one needs to just ask is what does a diverse cohort of people bring into the discipline? A diverse cohort of people brings diverse perspectives to the discipline, diverse critiques to the data that is generated, diverse frameworks of knowledge production, and hence I concur with you that it's absolutely essential to have as diverse a population of neuroscientists, say, but also as diverse a question, as diverse a community of any type of science. I mean, so,
Correct.
and also what's important to and that is and one thing is that there are lesser scientists, lesser women scientists and scientists from other marginalized genders in these institutions. There are and this is just the gender ratio that we're talking about. Caste ratios are also extremely skewed in Indian science institutions. I mean, if you look around, you'll hardly find Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi people. And trust me, I know because I have been trying to find out people to interview for thelifeofscience.com that it's a feminist science media collective that I work for. And we have been trying to look at identities in science for some time, and we are trying to find out Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi people who might be interested to be featured on the platform, whose sciences we want to cover. And I can tell you that it has been extremely difficult finding people, and that's simply because the numbers are atrociously low. So, and that's one thing. The other thing is about neurodivergence. The fact that a lot of us come with interesting perspectives to the discipline is often because we are not neurotypical. And that is also something, I mean, that understanding of disability is also extremely poor in science communities. You look around, you see a very skewed gender ratio, an even more skewed caste ratio, and an almost inexistent population of people with disabilities who are also scientists. So we are very, very far away from a diverse group, from becoming an institution, even one institution that can claim that, oh, we have amazing diversity of researchers in our institution. I mean, we're very, very far away from it, really, really far away. But we do need to get to a point that we are not. I'm not sure when that is going to happen, but we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. So if we don't have any more questions by the audience here, we could probably go to the YouTube live questions which we have right now. Um,
Yeah, let's take
okay.
a few.
Yeah. So Kirtana on YouTube Live asked this question about if there are any examples of how the frameworks should be changed to not consider queerness as the investigative factor apart from the straight norm.
I think Bittu, if you're willing, could you please take up the question if you're interested and you're willing to take it up.
I mean, I'm interested to hear your thoughts and the thoughts of other people, because what it'll take to sort of change this, I mean, of course, varies a lot. Obviously, you need to have a lot more queer people doing science and change the way in which, even if queer people do science, funding frameworks, institutional frameworks which reward certain kinds of science and punish other kinds, all of these are very hard to change. And in general, I think that for any of these things to change, one needs not sort of really reformist measures, but there is no way to change this without changing the structure of power in society overall. So it's very difficult to bring about these sort of small reforms in the context of science under capitalism. And it's very difficult to bring about these kinds of reforms when one has democracy imagined essentially. I mean, the standard model of democracy which we practice is majoritarianism, right? It's people voting and the majority winning. And I think we're seeing the consequences of majoritarianism, throughout in democracies across the world right now. So I think these are larger political questions which need to be addressed in order for us to, I don't think these can be addressed by reforms within science. But of course, within science, if the minority who is dissected is in charge of the discourse, or as a collective in charge of the discourse around the way in which the minority is described, rather than the majority being in charge of sort of pathologizing the minority. And this is, I think, true for around questions of gender, sexuality, caste, disability, and several other axes. I think unless those are certainly small improvements one can try, but they will be limited if the overall system is intact. The overall system of power, socioeconomic power.
Yeah. I mean, I fully agreeing with it. And also, just an anecdotal piece of evidence, if you might consider it such, is Kaiser, one of the people who were one of the very early members of the neurogendering networks and have come up with the few of the strongest critiques against neuroimaging work on sex and gender studies, has shown and has analyzed the number of papers with positive data, which is, yes, there is a difference between male and female brains in a particular cognitive task. The number of the positive data publications seem to be a lot more. So if I have negative data in a paper and I send it to a journal saying, here's my negative data, can you please publish it? Yeah. Very, very, very few journals really take up the job and publish it. Publishing becomes, so while my positive data might get into a big journal, my negative data will be taken up by a small journal, a journal with much lesser impact. So we don't even know whether some of these data that are there, whether they are true or not. I mean, somebody might have already come up with a negative data, but have never been able to publish it, which is why it has never gotten conveyed to us. So yeah, what it takes to change, I don't know. We need to break down the majoritarian structure of science per se. Yeah.
Okay. So another question is, why is critiquing gender studies considered a feminist issue? Isn't this how science should generally be practiced? Critiquing to finesse research.
Oh, well, I mean, I would really like science to be very critical of its biases and do science, but that is rarely the cause. I mean, I know that scientists will go to any lengths to defend their data, and I mean, critique is seen as a very difficult thing in science. So hence we as feminists often come into science and have to start critiquing it from the outside. Now there are some people like me who exist and shuffle between both the worlds, and I'm trying to bridge this understanding of critique. But as much as I would love to see that ideal science that does critique itself and nuance itself further, that does not unfortunately exist at the moment. And the feminist framework offers us a very, very strong framework to look at how science is looking into sex, gender, and sexuality, allowing us looking into discrimination, for that matter, looking into oppression, marginalization, and that gives us some leeway, some head start into breaking down, into dismantling these these notions that science propagates and exists on, builds on for that matter.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, continue.
I mean, if Ira is here, and if Ira would like to take that question, I'll be very happy. Probably not here. I mean, see, I mean, what I want to mention here is that when one says suffer, how does one know that A suffers from anxiety? The result is diagnosis. So I do see some merit in that argument, but I don't think I would be the best person to answer this question because I really don't have evidence for either. I mean, I don't have evidence whether women are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety. I don't have evidence for whether women are more likely to suffer from anxiety. But like I said, I can come up with a logical speculation that women who have to live with so much nonsense happening around them, so much suppression and so much oppression that the general society wants to, like sort of build upon, force upon women. I mean, I am, as a queer person, an extremely anxious person in the society. I mean, I feel extremely anxious when I walk out thinking that, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? So I can understand the bit about anxiety totally. But like I said, I don't have an answer to your question, and I don't think I should be trying to answer it.
Yeah, but I completely second that argument as well because since ages and ages, there's been oppression and there's been so if there has been oppression, then it won't be wrong to say that there would be effects on the mind, there would be effects on the brain, and yeah, so women being more likely to suffer or to be diagnosed from anxiety is just a reflection of how the society is treating the different genders, and it's not an equal treatment. It's not in treatment of equality even right now in this modern world. I don't think that is true.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Also, to build up on that, I think, does anybody know about how in animal models is there a certain thing like say females are more prone to it, or is it just in us humans
More prone to?
prone to anxiety or issues like that, or is it like just in
I don't
humans?
know. I don't know. I really don't know. If there's anybody who knows, please feel free to mute yourself and answer. But again, I mean, what I'm really trying to understand here is, um, why are we trying to extrapolate um, notions about human anxiety from animal models? I mean, animals have a lot less probably to worry about, and their consciousnesses
Yeah.
are probably more different than ours. So, I mean, that's just a genuine question from my side. I don't understand these parallels that people often draw between how animals feel versus how humans feel. I mean, I really feel that we cannot know how animals feel. Sorry about it.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
But
I
certainly
don't
there's
know. I mean, it's,
no, yeah,
yeah.
sorry, go
Please
ahead.
tell me.
I was just going to
No,
say
me too.
there's certainly no kind of meta sort of sense of females in the animal world being more, prone to anxiety. than males, anxiety is largely a context-specific behavior, right? So you can induce anxiety in a variety of ways. But this question of, and of course, a lot depends on the particular strains that you have in lab and so on. And so there just isn't the scope to get a sense of anxiety levels of male and female animals in the wild, and the wild itself is a often and constantly intervened in space. So essentially, we're not in a position to answer this question, I would say, as a scientific community.
I think the same, Bittu. I think the same. Also, thank you for joining today, Bittu. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Your presence is a major support.
No, I'm really glad this is being held and organized.
Right. Thanks to Project Encephalon.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, continue.
Are there any more questions? Are there any more questions? Sorry.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, maybe maybe that can be the last one. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, taking into consideration all the points discussed and keeping in mind how essential it is to critique the data that we get while studying the brain, the question which arises to me now is that how much of the brain, or is the brain really influenced by one's gender and sexuality? And if yes, then while studying or researching in topics related or unrelated to gender and sexuality, how much should we change, and what measures shall we take apart from critiquing it, of course, through the various methods that we have discussed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, Bittu, please add on after. Okay, I mean, I'm sure you will have more things to say, but what I think from my side is what you need to take a step back and you need to think as to why do you want to study sex, gender, and sexuality in the brain? I mean, does that have more merit because it is quote unquote in the framework of science versus studying sex, gender, sexuality in the society, for example? I mean, and that's just a critical argument that I'm trying to make here. Take a step back and probably think about why do I want to study sex, sexuality sex, sexuality, gender in the brain? A. B. Yes, most biological. I mean, because the neuroscience framework is heavily biologically dependent, biologically deterministic, not dependent. I'm sorry, because it's biologically deterministic. People seem to really like the idea that sex, gender, sexuality have very classic markers in the brain, and one can identify those. But seems that the predictive power of such research is really poor. I mean, if I give you a brain of a dead person and say nothing, can you look at the brain and tell me whether the brain belonged to a man or a woman, whether the brain belonged to a homosexual person or a heterosexual person? And this is something that has been studied by neurofeminists, and it seems like you can't. I mean, there are major overlaps between all these brains, and you cannot. I mean, the predictive power is extremely poor. The predictive power is almost non-existent. So that's from my side. Bittu, please add on if you have something more to say.
I mean, I would agree with your characterization. So, there's at some point there was a scientist who sort of came up with or wrote a paper called the gender similarities hypothesis, who was looking at the question of whether brains that are if one were to sort of look at a brain and this question of whether one can look at a brain and decide which sexed body that brain came from, or whether one could, and whether essentially brains are more similar across gendered categories than different. But I wouldn't agree. I mean, but this question of biological determinism and neuroscience, I think it's also been framed historically in sort of this, with this sort of understanding, or this sort of misunderstanding, really, that the ways in which society influences the brain are not thought of by neuroscientists, whereas the ways in which genetic determinism and neural determinism, I think, are very different things and should be. And so I think biological determinism conflates these two terms. So that's, I think, problematic for the following reason. Any self-respecting neuroscientist knows that brains are affected by behavior. Not all circuits are affected by one's life's experience, but social experience modifies several parts of the brain. So we know that there's a lot of plasticity in the brain. And one can certainly not be excused for at all thinking that outside of some model systems like nematodes and intestinal parasites, that in other systems that behavior is genetically kind of determined. But we do think that behavior is neurally determined, because we distinguish between the neuron is the site where genes can play out, and it's also the site, or the network of neurons is the site where your daily social experiences change structurally and functionally the brain. So we do think behavior is neurally biologically determined, because we don't think that a god or some kind of external force that doesn't have physical correlates is influencing behavior. We think that it is happening through neurons, but to be neurally deterministic is very different from being genetically deterministic. And a neural determinist has to agree to the fact that certainly in mammalian brains, and in several other organisms, experience changes the ways in which brains are structured, and of course how they function. So I think it's useful to tease these two terms apart when it comes to this question of biological determinism. And the other thing, sort of in response to the question that was asked, is this question of how, you said, how much is the brain influenced by gender and sexuality? Well, the brain is influenced by all experience. So you're certainly, your experiences of gender and sexuality will certainly influence your brain. But the question is of how much is to determine, do you want a number relative to what, right? So the question of how much is a question of what your standard is of something that strongly influences the brain. And that's where this question of titration arises, right? Are you just sort of talking about differences that are visible visible when you do certain kinds of measurements on the brain, or is one talking about how much one kind of experience versus another kind of social experience, how these may shape your brains? Those are questions that need to be asked in more definitive ways before one has answers to them.
Right. Thank you, Bittu. Yeah. Thank you for pitching in. I'm sure that's very interesting. But I think I'm eager to close now. Before Shresht takes it over, if any of you want to reach out to me later, I'm available at the email ID that I'm putting in the chat now. So if you would like further clarifications, questions, discussions, would be happy to join in. Here's my email ID, which probably has already been delivered. I don't know. It's dattasayantan95@gmail.com. Over to you, Shresht. Thank you for having me over here. Thank you, Bittu, for chipping in.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Really, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sayantan. That was a great talk. And thank you so much, Dr. Bittu. Your knowledge was really helpful here. And yeah, so we are Project Encephalon, and we are, as I said, a group of neuroscience enthusiasts who are currently from all diverse backgrounds. We are PhD students, we are master students, we have bachelor students, we have school students as well. And the aim is just to make a platform where all of us can come together, all of us can have invigorating discussions on neuroscience and allied fields, and all of us can somehow like pool in our opinions and our differences of opinions as well in constructive ways. And I think that is the main aim of Project Encephalon. You can check us on projectencephalon.org, and you can join in to become a member. And thank you so much. A very special thanks to Bittu and Sayantan. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining in, to all of the people on YouTube Live and on